Hey everyone, we're going to get on the phone here with a guy that I have a lot of respect for and I get a lot of information myself from. And his name is Dr. Mike Aamodt, Aamodt. He was one of the main professors at Radford University in the Department of Psychology. He taught forensic psychology and stuff like that, classes like that. But he also started something really neat. It was called the Serial Killer Information Center. And the research that him and his students have done for many years is some of the information that I use. And, you know, as I'm doing my research and interviewing all these serial killers, I see that a lot of the studies and a lot of the stats aren't matching up. And after I discovered this information center, I looked at the stats and I realized that these are the stats that I'm seeing. So I started taking a good look at the information, and it really did make sense. So we're going to ask Dr. Mike, I'm going to call him Mike, I think. We're going to ask him about some of the myths of serial killers. A couple of the ones I'm planning on asking him are, are serial killers white males in their mid to late 20s? Is that the profile? Do serial killers kill within their own race? That's a myth. Do they really do that, or is it different? How do serial killers kill? We mostly see in the movies it's strangulation and stabbing. Are those the most common methods of murder for serial killers? Are serial killers all male? And if not, how many of them are female? How many serial killers are active? There's kind of a myth that there's not too many active serial killers anymore. This was way back in the 70s and 80s, and it's not true. We're going to ask him, do they change their MO? Like, there's a myth that serial killers don't change their MO. So if you have a serial killer who's strangling women in Philadelphia, that's who you're looking for. And all of a sudden you find a body that's been stabbed, or one that's been set on fire, or one that's been drowned. A lot of law enforcement would think that that's not the same person because the MO is different. Well, the myth is MOs don't change. I think you're going to find that they do. Why do serial killers kill? A lot of people think serial killers kill mostly for lust or sex. And we're going to talk about that. That's a myth. And do serial killers ever get out of prison? So a lot of us think that serial killers never get released from prison, or if you make it to death row, you're never going to get released from prison or death row, and that's not true. We're going to get into all of that and more with Dr. Mike Aamodt, who's going to be calling here any second. So we're going to take on the myths. What are the myths of today's serial killers? We're going to talk a lot about Mike's research project with college students at the Radford University. Unfortunately, he's retired, but I really wanted to go speak to his class, his students, and I never got the chance to do that. So I want to find out if that still continues. You know, can you go and take classes at Radford University and be involved in his serial killer information center? A lot of the students did the research, which, how fun would that be? You're given a serial killer, and it's probably your research project, and probably your maybe you get a grade for the year. So here's Mike right now. We're going to take this call, and we're going to get ready to talk to him, and it's going to be exciting. Hey, are you there, Mike?
Hey, Phil. I'm here.
How are you?
Good. How about yourself?
And I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. I'm a big fan of yours. You know that?
Well, that's good to hear.
Man, I have so many questions. So I just did a little pre-video and talked a little bit about who you are and kind of what you do. But I guess I first want to just see who you are, what you've done, and then, dig into some of the myths and, some of what you've been doing research on. So how do you say your last name, Mike?
It's Aamodt, so it rhymes with a lot.
Aamodt. Okay, Aamodt. Dr. Mike Aamodt. Is it okay if I call you Mike?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So, Mike, were you the director of the Department of Psychology at Radford University, or what did you do at Radford?
So I was the head of the industrial organizational psychology program there.
Okay.
And so I was a professor and then headed up the IO program.
And you started the Serial Killer Information Center. How long did you work at Radford, and how long did you do the serial killer situation?
Okay, so I worked full-time at Radford for 26 years, and then I took advantage of a early retirement program to come on full-time with a consulting firm out of D.C. Mm-hmm. But for after I retired, I continued to teach a forensic psychology class for another 7 or 8 years, and then my business travel just got in the way of being able to teach that evening class.
Wow. So
and then for the
wait, so you did 26 years plus another 7, so 33 years.
yeah.
Wow. And how long did you do there? What gave you the idea to start the Serial Killer Information Center, and how did that start, and how long did that go on?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story in that my background is industrial psychology, and so those are the courses I taught. But my department chair came up to me one day and said, "You work with police departments, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Okay, good. You're teaching forensic psychology in the spring." And I said, "I don't know anything about forensic psychology." And he goes, "You're the closest we have." And so as I started putting together that course, I wanted to talk about aggression. And I thought that serial murder might be an interesting example of that. So after we talk about aggression in general, then we'll go ahead and talk about serial murder. But what I discovered was that at the time, and this is in the early 90s, that there really wasn't a lot of really good information about serial murder. There were a lot of, true crime types of books, that type of thing, but there really wasn't a lot of good information. So what I did was started an exercise in class where I had each of the students do a serial killer timeline. So I would assign them a serial killer, and then they would start with that serial killer's birth and then do a timeline all the way through their crimes, and then have them kind of think about how does this serial killer's life match up with what we talked about in class. Mm-hmm. And after a couple of years, started getting a lot of these because the class had 50 or 60 people in it each semester. Mm. And so I started taking that information and just putting them into an Excel spreadsheet. I had no thoughts about creating a big database. I just wanted something a little more systematic that I could use for class. And then it just started growing, and then students wanted to do more research. And so they started doing independent studies, for example, to get more information. And then I kind of got addicted to the database and have continued working on it to up to today.
Yeah, it's incredible. How long has it been online?
Well, the database itself, that's a tough question because the database itself is not online. People have to request access to it.
Okay.
But we formed a partnership years ago with Florida Gulf Coast University, and so there's a version of the database that's online there that you can request permission to have access to, but it's dated. It doesn't contain nearly as much information as in the one that we keep. But we do allow researchers legitimate researchers to request access to the actual database, and we'll send that to them.
So if anybody's listening to this, if you just go and Google Radford University Serial Killer Information Center, it does come up, and you can get some information on Mike and his work, and the information there is amazing. So what happened, Mike, for me is I started interviewing serial killers, like a lot of them, like hundreds of them. And what I was seeing in my interviews wasn't jiving with the information that was kind of out there about serial killers, like who they were and how they operated, what they did. And I was like, this is just not jive. Even some of the trainers in law enforcement were training things that I just didn't think was accurate. And so I discovered your page and your project, and at least what I can see. And I was like, this is jive. This more goes with what I'm seeing. And it just kind of opened my eyes. So I just wanted to ask you just some questions about the myths of serial killers. And then I'm just going to ask you random questions just about your background and your research, and just throw some things at you. Okay?
Sounds good.
In Mike's defense, I gave him no inkling what I was going to ask him today. So let's start with the first biggest myth. People think serial killers are white males in their mid to late 20s. Is that true?
It's not. So if we take a look at that profile of the white male mid to late 20s, if we go across all decades, about 12% of serial killers fit that profile. And if you go more recently, so since 1990, only 7.6% fit that profile. So if we go, for example, with the most recent, and we look at what percent are male, right? So that's 93.6%. Mm-hmm. If we look at what percent are white, it's 36.3. If it's mid to late 20s, 23.7, white males, 31.9, and then white male mid to late 20s, 7.6. So that
Wow.
7.6 doesn't, to me, make up a pretty accurate profile.
No, so if you're using that, and unfortunately, a lot of law enforcement, agencies across the country, they kind of just that's their wheelhouse. We're looking for a white male, mid to late 20s. That's kind of how it comes out, and even some of the profilers have given those kind of profiles. You're missing 93% of offenders, aren't you?
You are. Now the problem is when we start talking about a profile for a serial killer, right? It assumes that all serial killers are the same. So we're looking for this kind of common profile. But if you think about the definition of a serial killer, right, which is 2 or more homicides on 2 or more occasions, there are a lot of different types of people that fit in there. So, for example, you could have a person who kills 3 people in his life, but he kills people because he gets angry or he's drunk, and he's officially a serial killer, but it's not the type of person we think of when we think of a serial killer.
Right.
So one of the things in looking at profiles is we need to figure out how many really different types there are. And my guess is there are going to be quite a few different types, because based on their motive, based on their victim type, based on how they kill, and then take a look at profiles. And it could be that kind of the stereotype we have of what is a serial killer, somebody lurking out on the streets, randomly killing strangers. Maybe that white male, mid to late 20s, fits a little bit better. But because there are so many different types of serial killers, I think that's why that profile just doesn't hold.
I got you. And if we use some of the recent numbers, like even the 2010s, Mike, which I think is unbelievably mind-blowing, 58% of serial killers are black, 32% are white, 9% are Hispanic, and 0.5% are Asian. So even as we go closer to today, it even gets more flipped upside down, doesn't it?
It does, and why that's the case, I have no idea. But that's certainly one of the myths about serial murder is the race component.
And a lot of people, this is another myth. A lot of people think serial killers kill within their own race, Mike. So white serial killers kill white victims, black serial killers kill black victims. Is that true, or is there something different about that?
It's actually somewhat true, but like anything else with this, everything's going to be complicated. And so what we find basically is that for white serial killers, they typically only kill white victims. So about 82% of white serial killers will only kill white victims, whereas I think it's 44% of black serial killers that only kill black victims. So that complicates things as well.
Right. Yeah, so the way I explain to people, and this is why it's so important this is why your work is really important. I mean, I want you to know that, is if we are hunting for a monster, a serial killer who's killed 5 white females, let's say, or we're hunting for a serial killer who's killed 5 black children, we have to know who we're looking for. Knowing that white serial killers typically don't kill black victims, then, the profile is probably a black male serial killer. A lot of people are always just looking for white serial killers. And at the same time, if we have white victims, we have to open up our suspects list to everybody, don't we?
We do. And one of the goals we had at some point for our database was we were hoping that information could help come up with profiles. So if you knew for example, the characteristics of the victim, you looked at how the person was killed, you looked at where they were killed, that we might be able to come up with a little bit better profile in terms of estimating the sex, the race, the age of the serial killer. But so far, we haven't been real successful with that. And again, I think it goes back to we've got to figure out the type of serial killer. So first doing the type, and then doing the kind of that follow-up research to see if we can profile that person. I
always tell people the biggest similarity of serial killers is they're all different. There's nothing you can say, but they're all different. Everybody's different, and it's once we get away from trying to jam them all into certain Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, we can learn more about them. Method of murder. So we think serial killers lurking, strangling, and stabbing their victims up close and personal. But there's a new number coming out. What's the number one way serial killers kill their victims today?
They shoot their victims.
We're seeing more and more guns being used by serial killers.
We are. But again, it's one of those, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but when you think again of the people that fit the definition of the serial killer, you get people again who are angry that are killing neighbors. You get people who are robbing stores and killing employees, and so it's not surprising that they use guns. If we could come up with a way to look at all the serial killers and let's say classify them as the stereotype, kind of like the John Wayne Gacy. If we can take that group, that stereotype kind of serial killer, and look at the weapons, that might be very different. But because the definition is so broad,
Gotcha.
the fact that firearms is the number one weapon isn't necessarily
Makes
surprising.
Sense. Yeah. And we think serial killers are, if we watch movies, most serial killers are men and they're hunting for women. That's kind of like what you see in the movies and, even reading the books. But all serial killers are not males. We have had our share of female serial killers, have we not?
We have, and if you kind of go back in history, like looking at the early 1900s, for example, and maybe even into the 1800s, even though our data prior to 1900 aren't particularly great, about a third of serial killers were women. Now, keep in mind that that's serial killers that had been identified. There may have been all sorts of serial killers back then that we don't know about because of just media and everything. But they were killing husbands, they were killing family for financial gain. But if you think about with technology today, if you kill a husband and get insurance, and then you kill another husband and apply for insurance, that's going to be linked. Where if you were back in, let's say, 1910 and you moved, it would never be that link. So I think the fact that the percentage of female serial killers today is so much lower than it was back in the early 1900s is probably technology.
I think according to your research, though, I think it's like 7% are female. If you look at the numbers, it's probably over 300 female serial killers have been in the United States. Does that sound accurate?
It does.
Okay. And another one is serial killers don't change their MO. You have law enforcement working a case, and we have, let's say we have 3 women who are strangled to death in Philadelphia. Then we find a body, she's been stabbed. Then we find another body, she's been drowned. And another one's been, bludgeoned to death. Sometimes law enforcement won't connect those, but I think that's a myth, right? Like serial killers do change their MO, do they not?
They do. And so, for example, let's just think about the weapon that they use, the method of killing. Only 63% of serial killers use only one method. So even that 63 is a lot, but it's certainly not, 90 or 95. And if we think about their victims, that about 88% kill only somebody that's in the same age category, so adults, elderly. 73% kill only one race. 58% kill only one sex. 41% would be only one sex and one race, and it's 37% that would kill one sex, one race, one age category. So if we're looking for that victim being, let's say, a white female adult, that's only 37%.
Wow, that's interesting. That's one aspect I never thought about. So even their victims' age, race, that can change. Wow. So victims, again, going to what I said, you kind of think all serial killers are males, and their victims are females. That's kind of what you see out there. But the victim breakdown is a little different. It's almost 50-50 men and women. Is that what you've seen out there?
It is, yes.
And a majority of the victims are white, though. 68% are white, 25% are black. Is that the numbers that you've seen?
Yeah. So, and for the most recent data we have in terms of race, it's 65.7% are white, 26.9% are black, 6.9% are Hispanic, 1.7% are Asian.
Wow. Okay. So like the most predominant victim would be white female, closely followed by white males.
Right.
Interesting. So, how many serial killers do you think? The myth. I'll try the myth. There's not too many serial killers out right now killing. A lot of them were in the 70s and 80s, and we just don't see that. Technology has cut it down. But honestly, how many active serial killers do you think are out there at any given time?
No, that's a kind of a tough question, right? So it would be the question would be how many are there that we know about that are out there at a given time, and so I guess the best estimate we would have is in the last decade there probably were about 50 known serial killers that are active in a given year. You know, I've seen other people estimate a much bigger number, but these are the ones that we know that we're operating in any given year.
Those are the ones we know about. But
Now,
there's a lot of
now if you change, by the way,
Go ahead.
If you change the definition from 2 to 3 victims for a serial killer, it's about 28 a year at any given time.
So using 2 or more, which is a new FBI definition, at least 50 per year. But there's a lot of unsolved murders. So all you have to do is kill 2 people with the cooling off period. There could be, I always say there could be like 100 at any given time. Does that seem realistic to you? 100?
You know what? That's something I always refuse to kind of comment on, just because I don't have a clue.
Okay.
I just don't have an idea of how many of those out are unknown.
Okay. A lot of people think serial killers, again, looking at movies, they're lust killers. They're like, the Boston Strangler or, Jack the Ripper. They're out, lurking in the shadows and raping and killing women. But that is not the number one reason why serial killers kill. There are other reasons. What are some of the motivations of serial killers besides lust, killer, or sex?
So one of the big motivations is financial gain, and that can be robbery. It could be that the Black Widow, again, the spouse killing their spouse. There's a kind of a small group that kills for attention. That's mostly the Munchausen by proxy, but they kill for attention. There's a broad category where, like, for example, the lust would fit under, which would be enjoyment. So they're killing because they enjoy killing, either the killing itself. There might be some type of sexual component to it. It might be just because of power. And then another kind of a large category is anger. So whether it's just angry about the situation, or whether they are angry toward a certain group. So it might be a racial group. It might be that they're angry at sex workers. And then kind of the smallest group would be one that kills out of really kind of some type of psychosis. And these are the ones I think that the media kind of overhypes. That they have these people hearing voices and going out and killing. That's actually pretty small. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the kind of the controversial kind of motivations or types is something that we've labeled an organizational. Now, that's not to be confused with organized versus disorganized. Mm-hmm. But these are people who kill they meet the definition of a serial killer, but they're killing as part of an organization. So a cult would be an example. A gang would be an example of that. And a lot of people who study serial murder don't really think that these folks should kind of be with this category. And I agree, but they do fit that definition.
Yeah.
And then there's a small group that I think is just really interesting, and they make up only about 1% of serial killers, but their motivation is convenience. And those are people, for example, they just didn't want their babies. And so they killed multiple babies over time. They didn't want their spouse. And so it's not the same thing as a Black Widow who's killing for money. They just found it easier to kill their spouse than they did to divorce them.
What would be the number? Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
I was about to say, but then there's about 10% that have these multiple motivations, and that kind of goes back to a point you made earlier, that when you're trying to profile a serial killer, again, we make all these assumptions that they always have the same motive, the same type of victim, and all that. It's just not the case.
And what would you say the number one motivation is? What's number one in all your research?
Based on our numbers, it would be that enjoyment category.
They enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
And that includes, does that include the lust killer? Or?
It does, absolutely.
Okay. And have we ever released serial killers from prison, and have they gone on to kill again?
Well, and that's a good question and a tough one. So in some other countries, there have been serial killers released, and I haven't really found much information about whether they killed again. In the U.S., we very seldom release serial killers, but we do release people who have murdered in the past and who become serial killers, or because they meet the definition of kill again once they get out.
I was looking at some numbers. I don't know if you can comment on this, but 20 former death row inmates have been released from prison to kill again, and over 120 killers have been released to kill again. Have you ever looked at the numbers like that?
We have. So we've collected some data on people who had been in prison for murder, and then killed again once they got out, and so and they're in our database because they've got that 2 or more, and there are 588 of those in our database.
588.
Yeah,
Holy smokes.
So with that, so 18% of all the serial killers in our database had been in prison for murder, released, and then killed again.
Wow.
Yeah. No, we have to be. By the way, we have to be really careful with what we think we do with that number.
Yeah.
Because if you look at, and I'm not an expert on parole, but if you look at kind of recidivism rates, people who committed murder and who are released are one of the least likely to kill again. So I don't want people to interpret the statistics about the serial killers to mean that we don't think you should release murderers, because they're very unlikely to kill again. But when you talk about 588, that's a pretty big number.
It is
right?
a pretty big number. And it is a big number. Yeah. So who are some of the deadlier black male serial killers in your research project? Who have some of the higher body counts among black male serial killers?
You know what? That's not something I have in front of me.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you just rattle off any names that you know or no?
I'd rather not.
Okay. What do you think about Todd Kohlhepp, the guy that was a real estate agent who committed a mass murder, got away with it, and then went on a serial killing spree? Are you familiar with that case, and is that rare?
The name is certainly familiar and is in our database. We have this many names that they run together quite a bit. But there is an overlap. It's not a huge overlap, but there are a decent number of serial killers who are also mass killers.
Okay.
So they're not completely distinct.
I'm just going to rattle off a couple inmates or killers and just have you comment on it. What do you think of John Wayne Gacy? Somebody doesn't know who he is. They say, Mike, who is John Wayne Gacy? What is his deal?
Yeah, so John Wayne Gacy was a person who I think to most people seemed a pretty normal guy. Belonged to a lot of civic organizations, was a successful business person. And he was a person that killed young men. Many of them were his employees.
And how about Bonnie and Clyde? I'm holding up a magazine of theirs right now that was in the back of their vehicle, a detective magazine. So they're bank robbers. How do you classify Bonnie and Clyde?
Yeah, I don't know much about Bonnie and Clyde in terms of, I certainly know that they were bank robbers and they fit the definition of a serial killer. And that's a good example of when you have a John Wayne Gacy, which is kind of what your stereotype, right, for a serial killer, and then you've got a Bonnie and Clyde who fit that definition, but they're not what we would think of, and that's a good example, I think, of those two that you just showed of why you do have to separate these types.
And then I'm holding
into subtypes.
I'm holding here a Christmas card that Charles Manson sent me. What do you say about Charles Manson? A lot of people want to say he's a serial killer. He's not. But where does he fit in your research?
So he was somebody that early on we had in the database and then pulled him out because, as you say, he personally is not really a serial killer. And so what do you do with these folks that, let's say, hired people to kill multiple other people? They're certainly responsible for their death, but they didn't do the killing themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I think that those are difficult. And if you're going from a legal perspective, right, a person who hired somebody to kill or told somebody to kill, from a legal perspective, is going to be liable. But then if you're trying to think from a psychological perspective, since that person didn't do their killing themselves, do you want them in the same categories as people that did the killing themselves? And my thought is they should probably be not considered serial killers just from a psychological perspective, but they're people that certainly should be studied.
And one last question, or two more questions. One last question as far as like the psyche. How often do serial killers have sex with their victims after they're deceased? So how common is necrophilia and how common is cannibalism among serial killers?
Okay, give me a second here to see if I can find that. It's pretty rare, so let me just say that to begin with. But gotcha. Then, yeah.
Yeah, because we see, I've interviewed quite a few serial killers who do prefer sex after death and not before. And occasionally they do partake in cannibalistic activities. Not super common, but we are seeing it out there. I'm just curious to know if you've come across that.
Yeah. So, and again, these you have to kind of a little bit careful about these because when the person does engage, for example, in necrophilia, and they go to trial, right? It's going to be mentioned, but if they didn't, there's not going to be a statement somewhere that says, "Oh, by the way, they did not engage in necrophilia." So the data on this, you have to be a little bit cautious with this data. Mm-hmm. But of the folks that we have that we know yes or no, for necrophilia, it's about 3%. Cannibalism is about a little under 2%, and drinking blood is 0.7%. So not very, very common at all.
Okay.
And my guess is these numbers, by the way, will get even smaller if we had more information on the no's.
I got you. I see what you're saying. Yeah. You get the yeses, but you're not sure of the no's. Yeah.
Exactly. Same thing with, for example, like if you look at being abused as a child, that if they were, that kind of information typically will come out, at the end of the trial when they're trying to look at decide sentencing. But again, you don't get that person coming out saying, I didn't find any abuse or I didn't find any alcoholism. You only tend to get the yeses.
Interesting. So first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I know it's a Saturday for you and you have a day off. I want to ask you lastly what you're doing now, but the last question I have for you, what would you like to say to the world? When I look at your research, I want to get a megaphone and scream some of these myths so people would, especially law enforcement, the people that are hunting these killers, would be looking for the correct people. So if you were given a platform and you had the mic on a major platform and you wanted to say, because of my research, this is something I really want you guys to know, what would that be?
And this is going to be very, very boring, but it's going to be when you're studying serial murder, it's just much more complicated than you would think. And I was on a conference panel the other day, a virtual panel, and we were talking about police fatal shootings of citizens. And the thing I repeated over and over there was, it's complicated. It's much more complicated than you think. And the same thing with the serial murder. So if we're looking for that easy profile or we're looking for that one-size-fits-all, it's just not going to be there. You have to go through and meticulously gather data and then try to analyze how it fits a particular situation. And it's boring, but it's the way you have to do these things.
And of course, we have a lot of armchair quarterbacks out there that read a book, watch a movie, right? And they're experts now on this, and that's what we see out there. So what are you doing now? Go ahead, Mike.
I was about to say, the one thing to kind of also keep in mind is in the study of serial murder, there's a lot of different kind of types of professionals. And so, for example, my specialty really is just coming up with the numbers, trying to make sure that we understand what the situation is. But I'm not a person, for example, I've never spoken to a serial killer. And when I get calls from the press saying what's going through this person's mind, my response is, I'm not the guy to talk to. So that you have people out there who have really good insight into maybe why some of this is occurring. Mm-hmm. And then you'll get somebody like me that doesn't really have that type of insight necessarily, but more of a numbers person. So I think you just have to kind of stay in your lane.
Yeah. In the couple of the myths that I talk about from your research that people do, their brain can't accept it. It's two things. It's that serial killers are not white males in their mid to late 20s, and that serial killers use guns. They just can't believe that. It just doesn't equate for them. Is that something that you might see as well?
Absolutely. There was a dissertation, and I wish I would have written it down so I could always refer back to it, but it was a dissertation done within the last, I think, 5 years. But the student used our database to kind of look at the reality of serial murder statistics, and then looked at, I think it was 50 different films on serial killers, and compared the characteristics of the person in the film versus the database. And it was really interesting because, if I'm remembering right from her dissertation, all of the killers were white, all of the killers were men. They very seldom used guns, and so it was really really interesting portrayal of why we have these myths.
That's very interesting. Yeah, and that's what they see in the media and in movies. So what are you doing today? What is your current project? What are you doing? You're retired, but you're not. I know you're not retired. What are you doing now?
Well, so I work full time for a human resource consulting firm. That's so I'm really using more of my initial training. I still do a lot of analyses, but the analyses are making sure that companies are paying their employees fairly. So we look at sex differences in pay, we look at race differences in pay, and then provide feedback to the companies about what they're paying. So it's something very different from serial murder. But in terms of other research, I'm still doing my serial murder research, but I'm also doing some research on officers who were fatally shot on the job, and also doing some research on police fatal shootings of citizens, and really trying to do the same kind of thing of just trying to get a feel for the statistics and the data. And similar to the serial killer, it's a collection, the same type of collection of data, but just trying to get a feel for, is what the media is portraying, is it accurate or not? So
I'm about ready to get back in the real estate business, as well as interviewing serial killers, and you're kind of have the same situation. So you're talking to a company, you're like, I deal with human resources. By the way, on the side, I talk to serial killer, or on the side, I research serial killers, and they're like, what? Do you ever tell them your side project?
I don't, even though some of the people at work, when they're introducing me, will say that because people find it to be an interesting fact. Mm-hmm. But I was quoted, I don't know, this is maybe 4 years ago in, I think it might have been like the New Yorker, but one of the attorneys I deal with with my work calls me up and said, "Hey, this isn't you, is it?" And I said, "Yeah, it's the same person." And he just started laughing because he goes, "I would have never guessed."
Yeah, they're like, yeah, that's the reaction I get to. That's so funny. Well, listen, man, thank you so much. We're going to use this hopefully for an episode of Where the Bodies Are Buried, and it's a podcast. And I'm also going to use this on my YouTube channel. We appreciate and thank you for all the work you do and you've done, and all your great students that have helped with this project. It's priceless, really.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. And it was great talking with you.
Thanks so much, Mike. Have a great day.
You too. Take care.
Thanks. Well, there you go. Mike Aamodt. Interesting conversation. And, a lot of people will read a book, listen to a podcast, and all of a sudden they're experts. And I see this a lot in my work. People get on my social media and argue with me, and, you don't know, and you can't, and it's you have to kill 3 or more. I hear this all the time. And I just kind of laugh, and I don't say much, everybody's an expert. But you know who the experts are? A guy like Mike, who has been researching these numbers for decades. 33 years to be exact. Somebody like me who's been interviewing killers for 35 years. I mean, you know, it takes time. It takes a lot of work to figure these things out, to get the facts, to get the information, and to get what you're looking for. It takes years. It takes so much work. If I showed you my files next door, I have 4 file cabinets jammed full of folders and letters of each killer. And it's, we appreciate guys like Mike, the FBI profilers, John Douglas, Robert Ressler, Roy Hazelwood. A lot of those guys have done a lot of years and years of their life's work. So hope you enjoyed that video. Like, comment, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so we don't miss any videos like this, because I'm going to be interviewing a lot more experts coming up. You're not going to want to miss it. Have a great day. Be safe, everybody.